What if I told you the United States government once poisoned its own citizens on purpose? That a president kept a pet raccoon in the White House? That we actually fought a war over a pig and the pig was the only casualty? You'd probably think I was making it up. Some weird alternative history where nothing makes sense and everything sounds like a fever dream. But here's the thing: every single word you're about to hear is completely, verifiably, documentably true. American history is stranger than any fiction writer would dare to imagine. We've got presidents who feared electricity, coins that cost more than they're worth, and an entire camel corps wandering the Arizona desert. We've banned Christmas, mailed children through the post office, and created states that never actually existed. So before we dive in, if you're ready for the weirdest, most unbelievable facts that actually happened, hit that subscribe button. You're going to want to remember where you heard these stories, starting with a war that's almost too ridiculous to believe. The Pig War, when pork nearly destroyed diplomacy. Picture this: 1859 San Juan Island, tucked between what's now Washington State and Canada. Two nations, the United States and Britain, are staring each other down over a disputed border. Tensions are high, troops are mobilizing, cannons are positioned. And the whole thing started because an American farmer shot a pig. Not just any pig, mind you. A British pig. A large black boar that had been eating the farmer's potatoes. One bullet, one dead pig. And suddenly you've got an international incident that almost triggered the Third War between America and Britain. Here's the beautiful part: they sent warships, actual naval vessels. Hundreds of soldiers camped on this tiny island for 12 years, glaring at each other across the tree line. And in all that time, with all those armed men in close quarters, not a single human died, just the pig. The only casualty of the pig war. Which makes you wonder what other conflicts could have been resolved with better fence maintenance. But we'll never know because international relations aren't usually that simple. Benjamin Franklin's glass music box. Speaking of things that shouldn't work but somehow do, let's talk about Benjamin Franklin's spare time. Because apparently inventing bifocals, mapping the Gulf Stream, and helping found a nation wasn't enough to keep the man busy. No, he also decided to reinvent a musical instrument: the glass harmonica. Picture a series of glass bowls nested inside each other, spinning on a rod while you touch them with wet fingers. It sounds like something a sleep-deprived person would hallucinate, but Franklin actually built one in 1761, and it became wildly popular. So popular, in fact, that Mozart wrote for it. Beethoven wrote for it. Marie Antoinette took lessons on it. The sound was described as ethereal, haunting, almost supernatural, like hearing music from another dimension filtered through water glasses at a dinner party. Eventually, people started claiming the instrument caused madness, depression, and mysterious illnesses in its players. Probably just the lead in the glass and poor ventilation, but the harmonica fell out of fashion. Still, imagine Franklin in his workshop, spinning wet glass and creating something beautiful between experiments with electricity. A man of endless curiosity. 38 minutes of regret. Now, if you think the Pig War was brief, let me introduce you to the shortest war in recorded history involving American forces. 1896, Zanzibar, East Africa. The Sultan died and his nephew seized power without British approval. This was a problem because Britain had arrangements with Zanzibar and America had interest there too. The British gave an ultimatum: step down by 9 a.m. or face consequences. The new Sultan refused, barricaded himself in the palace with about 4,000 defenders, and probably thought he'd make a stand. At 9:02 a.m., British warships opened fire. By 9:40 a.m., it was over. 38 minutes. The palace was shelled, the Sultan fled to the German embassy, and that was that. most one-sided military action you've ever heard of. American interests were protected, British authority restored, and somewhere a clockmaker realized his product outlasted an entire war. It makes you appreciate conflicts that at least last long enough to brew a pot of coffee. Though perhaps we shouldn't romanticize warfare, no matter how absurdly brief. When the government poisoned your drink, here's where American history takes a darker turn, but one that's best understood calmly and carefully. In 1920, Prohibition began. Alcohol was illegal nationwide, yet many Americans continued drinking anyway, often using industrial alcohol that had been redistilled for consumption. This presented the federal government with a dilemma: how to discourage illegal drinking without dramatically expanding enforcement. The solution they chose was controversial. The Treasury Department ordered manufacturers of industrial alcohol to add chemical denaturants, substances meant to make it unsafe to consume. The intention was deterrence. If industrial alcohol was unpleasant or dangerous to drink, people might stop trying to turn it into liquor. What followed was a public health failure. Despite knowing that some people would still attempt to redistill and drink this alcohol, the program continued for years. Medical professionals warned that the policy was causing widespread harm, and newspapers reported on increasing numbers of illnesses connected to contaminated alcohol. Bootleggers tried to remove the additives, sometimes successfully, often not. By the end of Prohibition in 1933, thousands of people had been affected nationwide. The episode became one of the most debated enforcement strategies in American history. A stark example of how policy decisions made with good intentions or political pressure can produce unintended consequences. It remains a reminder that public health, morality, and law enforcement don't always align neatly, and that history's most troubling moments are often rooted in complicated choices rather than simple villains. Which brings us to a president who preferred his secrets written quietly, rather than distilled at all. The Secret Diary of John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams kept a diary. This in itself isn't remarkable. Lots of historical figures journaled. But Adams started his at age 12 and continued for 68 years, creating one of the most comprehensive records of early American political life ever written. Here's the interesting part. Portions of it were in code. Not complex espionage-level encryption, but a simple substitution cipher he used for sensitive political observations and personal thoughts. Historians spent decades trying to fully crack it, finally succeeding in the 20th century when they could cross-reference enough entries to break the pattern. What did they find? Mostly what you'd expect: political intrigue, personal anxieties, observations about colleagues. Nothing earth-shattering. But the fact that a president felt the need to encrypt his own diary tells you something about how he viewed privacy and posterity. Adams was meticulous, brilliant, and apparently convinced that even his personal journals might someday be political weapons. He wasn't entirely wrong. And while Adams was writing in code, the building he'd eventually work in was getting an unexpected makeover. Why the White House is actually white? Quick question. Do you know why the White House is white? Like specifically white? Because it wasn't originally. The building was constructed from Aquia Creek sandstone, which has a lovely pale beige color. It would have stayed that way too, if not for some British soldiers and their enthusiasm for arson. 1814, the War of 1812, is winding down, and British forces decide to make a statement by torching Washington, D.C. The presidential mansion, as it was then called, gets burned. Not completely destroyed, but heavily damaged, with significant smoke and fire damage to the exterior stone. When reconstruction began, workers covered the burn marks and smoke stains with white paint. Lots of white paint. The building had been informally called the White House before, But after 1814, the name stuck because suddenly it was undeniably brilliantly white. So technically, we can thank British aggression and subsequent cover up efforts for one of America's most iconic building colors. Strange how vandalism and restoration combine into tradition. And speaking of life after the presidency being unexpectedly dramatic, the congressman who collapsed at his desk. Most presidents retire quietly. They write memoirs, give speeches, and gradually fade from public life. John Quincy Adams did something different. After leaving the presidency, Adams ran for Congress and won. He would serve there for 17 years, becoming one of the most active and outspoken former presidents in American history. In the House of Representatives, he earned the nickname Old Man Eloquent, known especially for his relentless opposition to slavery and his belief that public service didn't end with the White House. On February 23, 1848, Adams was at his desk in the House chamber when he suddenly became ill. Colleagues quickly noticed something was wrong and rushed to his side. He was moved from the chamber to a nearby room, where he was attended to by fellow lawmakers and physicians. Adams lingered for 2 days, surrounded by people who had known him not just as a president, but as a lifelong public servant. He passed away on February 23rd, never fully regaining consciousness. There was something quietly symbolic about it. A man who had devoted nearly his entire life to government service spent his final moments inside the building, where he continued that work long after his presidency ended. He didn't leave public life behind. He simply kept going until he couldn't anymore. It's not how most people imagine retirement. But for John Quincy Adams, public duty was never a phase. It was the through line of his entire life. And while Adams was leaving his final mark on American government, another national symbol was making its own unforgettable debut. The Liberty Bell's unfortunate debut. The Liberty Bell is perhaps America's most famous symbol of independence and freedom. It's also hilariously defective. Cast in London in 1752, shipped to Philadelphia for the Pennsylvania State House, the bell cracked the very first time it was rung. Not after years of use, not from some dramatic historical moment, just immediately. First ring. Crack. Like buying a new phone and watching the screen shatter when you take it out of the box. Local metalworkers John Pass and John Stowe melted it down and recast it. Twice, actually, because the first recast sounded terrible. The third version sounded better and became the bell we know today, though it would crack again, famously and finally, in the 1800s. There's something beautifully American about making a broken thing into a national symbol. The Liberty Bell doesn't work properly, has never worked properly, and we've collectively decided that's fine. It represents freedom anyway, cracks and all. And speaking of symbols, the American flag has its own unexpectedly humble origin. The B- that became the flag, 1958. Lancaster, Ohio. 17-year-old Robert Heft is sitting in history class, and his teacher assigns a project: design something meaningful. Heft, living in a time when Alaska and Hawaii are about to become states, decides to redesign the American flag with 50 stars instead of 48. He sews it himself, arranges the stars in staggered rows of 6 and 5, presents it to his teacher, who gives him a B-. The teacher's reasoning: it lacks originality. There's no way it'll ever be accepted as the actual flag. Heft, stubborn as teenagers can be, sends his design to the White House. President Eisenhower sees it, likes it, and when both Alaska and Hawaii join the Union in 1959, Heft's design becomes the official American flag. The teacher changed the grade to an A. That flag has been official since July 4th, 1960. The longest-serving flag design in American history came from a high school project that initially failed. Every time you see those 50 stars, remember, a teacher somewhere gave them a B-. though not every territory proposed for statehood worked out quite so well. The territory that almost was before Colorado became a state in 1876, there was almost a territory of Jefferson, not the one you're thinking of. This was 1859, early 1860s, when gold miners in the region decided they were too far from Kansas territorial government to receive proper representation or law enforcement. So they just made their own government, called it Jefferson Territory, elected officials, established courts, levied taxes. The whole operation, it wasn't recognized by the federal government, but it functioned anyway for about 2 years, operating in a strange legal gray area where it was simultaneously official and completely unauthorized. Eventually, the federal government caught up and established Colorado Territory in 1861, which absorbed Jefferson and its informal governance structures. But for a brief, strange moment, American expansion was crowdsourced by people who got tired of waiting for official channels. Self-government through collective frustration. It's either deeply democratic or mildly anarchist, depending on your perspective. Meanwhile, in South Dakota, a mountain was about to get very personal attention. Washington's nose knows Mount Rushmore. 4 presidential faces carved into granite, one of America's most recognizable monuments. Construction began in 1927, led by sculptor Gutzon Borglum, and the first face completed was George Washington's nose. Not his whole face, just the nose. Finished in 1930. Workers spent months drilling, dynamiting, and carving this single facial feature, while the rest of Washington remained rough stone. Imagine hiking up the mountain during that period and seeing one giant presidential nose jutting from the rock. No context, no explanation. It's weirdly appropriate. Actually, Washington was first in so many things. First president, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen, and now, first facial feature completed on Mount Rushmore. Always leading, even when it's just a nose. The monument wouldn't be finished until 1941. Borglum died before completion, and his son continued the work, but Washington's nose, done by 1930, presidential punctuality even in granite. And speaking of unusual American innovations with unexpected staying power, the U.S. Camel Corps Experiment 1855, the American Southwest. The Army's got a logistics problem. How do you transport supplies across vast desert terrain with limited water sources? Horses and mules need too much water. The solution, proposed by Jefferson Davis, then Secretary of War, before his Confederate days, was obvious: import camels. So they did. 75 camels from the Middle East, along with handlers who actually knew what they were doing. The U.S. Camel Corps was born, and for a brief period, American soldiers were riding around Texas and Arizona on dromedaries, which must have been surreal for everyone involved. The camels worked beautifully, they could carry more weight, travel longer distances, needed less water. It should have been a permanent solution. But then the Civil War happened, the project lost funding and attention, and the camels were auctioned off. Some escaped into the wild, creating a brief population of feral camels in the American desert. There are still reported sightings sometimes. Probably not real, but it's nice to imagine descendants of those military camels still wandering Arizona. Speaking of strange survivals, okay, so here's where okay came from. The word okay is perhaps the most universally recognized American contribution to global language. It's used everywhere, means roughly the same thing in hundreds of contexts, and its origin is beautifully, pointlessly absurd. 1839, Boston. There's a fad among young writers and newspaper editors for intentional misspellings and abbreviations. Not text speak, this was paper and ink, but deliberate creative misspellings for humor. All correct became all correct, abbreviated OK. It caught on during the 1840 presidential campaign when Supporters of Martin Van Buren used it as a slogan, standing for Old Kinderhook, Van Buren's nickname from his New York hometown. The dual meaning gave it enough cultural weight to survive. And here we are, almost 200 years later, saying okay multiple times daily without thinking about Boston newspaper writers giggling over intentional spelling errors. Language is weird, culture is weirder, which brings us to another weird cultural moment that required federal intervention. Please stop mailing your children. Early 1900s, the U.S. Postal Service has established parcel post, allowing people to mail packages domestically at reasonable rates. The regulations specify weight limits, dimensions, and prohibited items. What they didn't explicitly prohibit initially, humans, small humans, specifically children. A few parents, especially in rural areas with limited transportation, realized you could technically mail your child to grandma's house if they weighed under 50 pounds and you paid the appropriate postage, usually just a few cents, cheaper than train fare. The most famous case, 1913 Ohio. May Piersdorf, age 4, mailed to her grandmother's house 53 miles away. She rode in the mail car with the package handlers, who were apparently good sports about the whole thing. The Postal Service, recognizing this was getting out of hand, officially banned the mailing of humans in 1920. It shouldn't have needed to be a rule, but here we are. At least the children arrived safely. Meanwhile, a statue in New York Harbor had an identity crisis. The Statue of Liberty's first life. The Statue of Liberty, that iconic symbol of American immigration and freedom, wasn't originally designed for America at all. French sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi first conceptualized the statue in the mid-1860s as Egypt carrying the light to Asia, meant to stand at the entrance of the Suez Canal. The design featured a robed woman holding a torch, representing progress and enlightenment. Egyptian officials considered it, then politely declined, probably because massive neoclassical statues are expensive and they had a canal to worry about. So Bartholdi repurposed the concept, made her more Roman, less Egyptian, added a tablet, pitched it to America as a monument to liberty and Franco-American friendship, and in 1886, she arrived in New York Harbor in pieces, was assembled on what was then called Bedloe's Island, and became Lady Liberty. She was almost a lighthouse for Egypt. Instead, she became a symbol of hope for millions of immigrants. Sometimes rejection leads to better opportunities. And speaking of territories that almost were, the territory of Orleans and Louisiana's origins. Before Louisiana became a state in 1812, it was the territory of Orleans, created in 1804 right after the Louisiana Purchase. This massive land deal, 828,000 square miles, bought from France for $15 million, needed organizing, and Congress decided to carve out the area around New Orleans as its own territory. The territory of Orleans was unique because it had a French legal system, predominantly Catholic population, and a culture completely different from the rest of the United States. Congress had to figure out how to incorporate this into American governance without destroying what made it distinct. It worked, mostly. Orleans Territory became Louisiana State, kept elements of French civil law that still exist today, and proved that American expansion could occasionally be sensitive to existing cultural identities. The rest of the Louisiana Purchase became various other territories and states, but Orleans got there first. New Orleans, leading the way as always. Though not everything Southern worked quite so smoothly. Some presidents, for instance, had very hands-on management styles. President Cleveland answers his own phone, Grover. Cleveland, president from 1885 to 1889, and again from 1893 to 1897, had a quirk. When the White House phone rang at night, he answered it himself. No staff, No operators, just the president picking up the receiver and saying hello. This was partly because Cleveland was a micromanager who didn't fully trust his staff with everything, and partly because phone technology was still relatively new and he found it fascinating. Imagine calling the White House at midnight and getting the actual president on the line. It didn't last long. Eventually, staff convinced him this was inefficient and potentially dangerous from a security standpoint. But for a brief period, Cleveland was the most accessible president in American history, at least by telephone. He also performed his own wedding ceremony in the White House, married a woman 27 years younger than him, and had a candy bar named after his daughter, Baby Ruth. Busy man. Speaking of people with too much gold, the $50 gold piece. 1854 California gold rush is in full swing, and the U.S. Mint decides to create the largest denomination gold coin ever made for circulation, a $50 gold piece. Called the Slug by Californians, this thing weighed 2.4 ounces of pure gold. Only a few hundred were ever minted. They were impractical, too valuable for regular use, too tempting for theft. Most were melted down eventually or kept as novelties. But for a brief moment, you could theoretically walk around with what would today be worth over $4,000 in a single coin in your pocket. The $50 gold piece represents peak American optimism about mineral wealth. We've got so much gold, let's make ridiculous coins. It didn't last, but it's a beautiful snapshot of 1850s California excess. And speaking of excess, let's talk about the first time America taxed income. The first income tax, 3% and rising. 1861, the Civil War begins, and the federal government suddenly needs enormous amounts of money to fund armies, supplies, and a war effort that nobody expected would last 4 years. Traditional revenue sources, tariffs and excise taxes, aren't cutting it. So Congress does something radical. They passed the Revenue Act of 1861, creating the first federal income tax in American history. 3% on all incomes over $800 annually. Sounds quaint now, doesn't it? 3%. Like a polite suggestion rather than a tax. By 1862, they'd already revised it, creating a progressive system. 3% on income between $600 and $10,000, 5% on anything above that. America's first graduated tax bracket, born from financial desperation. The tax was repealed after the war ended, deemed unconstitutional in 1895, and didn't permanently return until the 16th Amendment in 1913. But that first wartime income tax established a precedent. When the government needs money badly enough, your paycheck becomes negotiable. Speaking of ambitious territorial schemes that didn't quite work out, the state of desert that never was, 1849, Mormon settlers in the Utah region, led by Brigham Young, petitioned Congress for statehood. But they don't want just Utah. They proposed the state of Deseret, a massive territory covering most of present-day Utah, Nevada, significant portions of California, Arizona, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, Oregon, and Idaho. Roughly 500,000 square miles. The name Deseret came from the Book of Mormon meaning honeybee, symbolizing industry and cooperation. The proposed state would have stretched from the Sierra Nevada to the Rockies, from the Oregon border nearly to Mexico. Congress looked at this proposal and essentially said absolutely not. Instead, they created Utah Territory in 1850, a fraction of the requested size. The state of Deseret remained a provisional government for a few years, operating alongside the official territorial government in a strange dual system arrangement. Eventually, it dissolved. Utah didn't become a state until 1896, and it was much, much smaller than Deseret would have been. Sometimes ambition exceeds political reality, but at least the flag got regular updates, 27 versions of Stars and Stripes. The American flag has been redesigned 27 times since 1777. 27. That's more makeovers than most people's living rooms. Each time a state joined the Union, someone had to figure out where to put another star, how to arrange them, whether the stripes should change too. The current 50-star version, designed by that high school student Robert Heft, has been official since July 4th, 1960, when Hawaii joined. That makes it the longest lasting flag design in American history, over 60 years and counting. Before that, the previous record holder lasted 47 years. Early flags were chaotic, stars arranged in circles, rows, scattered randomly. No official pattern until much later. The 13 stripes stayed constant after 1818, when Congress decided adding a stripe for every state would make the flag look ridiculous. Imagine explaining to someone from 1776 that their flag design would need 26 updates. They'd probably ask why we kept adding states. Fair question. But some additions to American culture were stranger than new states. When pinball was illegal, 1942, New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia declares war on pinball machines. Not metaphorically. He literally orders police raids on pinball parlors, confiscates thousands of machines, and has them smashed with sledgehammers. The destroyed machines are dumped into the river, which seems excessive but made for good photos. The reasoning? Pinball was gambling. The machines were rigged, controlled by organized crime, corrupting the youth. Never mind that pinball is mostly luck and gravity. It was banned in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and other major cities for decades. The ban lasted in New York until 1976, when a pinball wizard named Roger Sharp testified before the city council and proved, by playing a perfect game demonstrating skill, that pinball wasn't purely chance. The council was convinced. Pinball became legal again. So, for over 30 years, pinball was contraband. You could go to a speakeasy during Prohibition easier than you could legally play pinball in some American cities. Speaking of unusual currency situations, when banks printed their own money, 1850s, California Gold Rush era, and the Free Bank of San Francisco decides it doesn't need federal approval to print money, so it just does. Issues its own banknotes, backs them with gold deposits, and operates as a private currency system. This wasn't technically illegal yet. Before the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864, private banks could issue their own currency, and many did. Hundreds of different designs, values, and institutions printing money created chaos. Counterfeiters had a field day because who could tell what was legitimate when there were thousands of different valid designs? The Free Bank of San Francisco was one of many, but it operated during peak confusion when California was flush with gold and short on federal oversight. Their notes circulated alongside state-issued currency, federal coins, and foreign money. Transactions must have been nightmarishly complicated. Eventually, the federal government monopolized currency printing, probably for the best. Though it does make you wonder what a return to private currencies might look like. Actually, don't think about that too hard. Speaking of presidents with unexpected backgrounds, Lincoln's saloon days, Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, preserver of the Union, author of the Gettysburg Address, was also briefly a licensed bartender. 1833, New Salem, Illinois. Lincoln and his friend William Barry purchased a general store that included a tavern license, making them legal alcohol vendors. The business failed spectacularly. Barry drank the inventory. Lincoln was better at reading law books than managing accounts, and they went into debt. Lincoln called it his national debt and spent years paying it off. But for a brief period, if you wanted a drink in New Salem, Lincoln might have served you. He later spoke against alcohol, though not as a total prohibitionist. More of a moderation is wise perspective, probably informed by watching his business partner literally drink their profits. There's something beautifully human about it. Before he saved the nation, Lincoln couldn't save a bar. We all start somewhere, though some American experiments started stranger than failed taverns. The Republic of Indian Stream, 1832 to 1835, there existed a tiny independent nation on the border between New Hampshire and Quebec called the Republic of Indian Stream. Population, about 300 people. Cause, a surveying error left the boundary undefined, and nobody could agree who had jurisdiction. The residents got tired of being claimed by both the US and Britain, taxed by both, receiving services from neither. So they declared independence, wrote a constitution, elected officials, and governed themselves for 3 years. It worked surprisingly well. They had courts, settled disputes, maintained order. But eventually, both the US and Britain sent militias to assert control. The residents, pragmatic people, decided independence wasn't worth getting shot over and joined New Hampshire. The Republic of Indian Stream lasted barely 3 years, barely 300 citizens, and barely appears in history books. But for that brief moment, there was a fully independent micronation in North America. Born from bureaucratic confusion and sustained by communal stubbornness, which brings us to a law that sounds like science fiction. The Alien Notification Act, 1969, the height of space race paranoia and optimism, Congress passed a law requiring that the president be notified immediately if aliens, extraterrestrial aliens, not immigrants, were discovered. It's still technically on the books, tucked into Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations. The reasoning was practical. If we made first contact, the president needed to know before the media, foreign governments, or random scientists announced it to the world. Chain of command for extraterrestrial diplomacy. The law also made it illegal to touch alien life forms or their spacecraft without authorization. Violation could result in 1 year in prison and a $5,000 fine. So if you find a crashed UFO, look but don't touch, and call the White House immediately. Has it ever been invoked? Almost certainly not. Does it exist? Absolutely. Is it somehow comforting that there's a plan, however minimal? Maybe. Though not all proposed territories needed alien intervention to fail. Just politics. The territory of Lincoln that wasn't 1860s, the Dakota Territory, was enormous, covering present-day North and South Dakota and parts of Montana and Wyoming. Some residents proposed splitting it and creating a Territory of Lincoln in the northern section, honoring the recently assassinated president. Congress considered it. The name had support. Lincoln's legacy was being cemented in American consciousness, and geographical naming seemed appropriate. But political complications, population disputes, and questions about where exactly to draw boundaries killed the proposal. Dakota Territory eventually split in 1889, becoming North and South Dakota, admitted to statehood on the same day. President Benjamin Harrison deliberately shuffled the paperwork so nobody knows which became a state first. No Territory of Lincoln, though. Lincoln got a memorial, a penny, and countless schools and streets. Just not a territory. Perhaps naming an entire region after someone sets expectations too high. Speaking of high expectations and unusual coins. The $20 coin with a hole. 1850s California, during the peak of the gold rush, produced some unusual coinage. One of the strangest, private mints occasionally created $20 gold pieces with holes in the center, not official U.S. mint products, but private assayers creating their own denominations. The holes served a practical purpose, making it harder to shave gold off the edges, a common form of fraud. If the coin had a hole, any tampering would be obvious. Some miners and merchants preferred them for this reason. These coins weren't legal tender in the traditional sense, but in Gold Rush, California, if it was gold and both parties agreed on value, it spent like money. The region operated on a fascinating hybrid economy of official coins, private issues, gold dust by weight, and creative improvisation. Most of these hold coins were eventually melted down for their gold content. The few surviving examples are worth far more than $20 to collectors today. Meanwhile, in Washington, a political party with a very unusual name was gaining power. The Know Nothing Party's brief rise. 1855. A political party called the Know Nothings won 43 seats in Congress. Not the Know Somethings or the We're Pretty Sure party, the Know Nothings. The name came from their origins as a secret society. When asked about their activities, members were supposed to say, "I know nothing." Officially called the American Party, they were primarily anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic, opposing the waves of Irish and German immigration in the mid-1800s. Their platform was nativist, their tactics were secretive, and their influence was briefly significant. They won state elections, controlled legislatures, elected governors. Former President Millard Fillmore ran as their presidential candidate in 1856 and carried one state. But the party collapsed quickly, torn apart by internal divisions over slavery, and absorbed into other political movements. The Know Nothings remind us that American politics has always been chaotic, factionalized, and sometimes named after what members claim not to know. Which brings us to a president who actually didn't know English, at least not initially. Martin Van Buren's Dutch childhood. Martin Van Buren, 8th President of the United States, grew up speaking Dutch. Not as a second language, but as his first. He was born in Kinderhook, New York in 1782 to a Dutch-speaking family in a Dutch-speaking community. English came later, learned in school and through interaction with the broader American culture. He's the only U.S. president whose first language wasn't English. This gave him a unique perspective on American identity and immigration, though his later political positions on various issues were more conventional than his linguistic background might suggest. Van Buren's Dutch heritage also gave him his nickname, Old Kinderhook, which contributed to the phrase "okay," as discussed earlier. His entire presidency has linguistic footnotes attached. By the time he reached the White House in 1837, his English was obviously fluent, refined, and politically effective. But somewhere in his mind, there was probably still a kid from Kinderhook thinking in Dutch. Language shapes thought. Wonder how that shaped his presidency. Speaking of unusual shapes, the half-dollar that wasn't half early American coinage included a half-dollar that was, confusingly, larger than later dollar coins. The silver half-dollars minted in the late 1700s and early 1800s were substantial chunks of metal, bigger and heavier than the later silver dollars most people think of. This wasn't intentional deception. The denomination referred to value, not size. A half-dollar was worth 50 cents, regardless of its physical dimensions. But the actual size and weight varied depending on silver content, minting standards, and which era you're discussing. Imagine the confusion. You've got a coin called a half-dollar that's physically larger than a coin called a dollar. It's like calling a large coffee small and a small coffee medium, which actually some coffee chains do. Maybe we've learned nothing. The modern half-dollar, rarely seen in circulation, is smaller and made mostly of copper. The silver versions are collector items now, worth far more than 50 cents. Currency used to be so much more complicated. Speaking of complications, Confederate Arizona's brief existence. 1861 to 1862. While the Civil War raged back east, the Confederate States claimed the southern half of New Mexico Territory as Confederate Arizona. Not the Arizona we know today. The boundaries were completely different, running east west rather than north south. The Confederacy appointed a governor, established a capital in Mesilla, and claimed jurisdiction over the region. Union forces largely ignored this claim, being preoccupied with actual battles elsewhere. Confederate Arizona existed mostly on paper and in the imaginations of a few ambitious politicians. By 1862, Union forces reclaimed the area. The Confederacy lost interest. Confederate Arizona dissolved, having accomplished essentially nothing except creating confusion for future historians trying to track territorial boundaries. It's a footnote to a footnote, a failed breakaway territory within a failed breakaway nation. History is full of these small, strange attempts at changing maps. Though some laws try to change culture itself, when foreign languages were banned in schools in 1918, America is fighting World War I, anti-German sentiment is running high, and several states decide that speaking German, or any foreign language, in schools is unpatriotic and possibly dangerous. So, they ban it. Nebraska, Iowa, Ohio, and others passed laws prohibiting the teaching of foreign languages in primary schools. The reasoning was forced assimilation. If immigrant children couldn't speak their parents' languages, they'd become more American. Never mind that multilingualism is beneficial, that heritage matters, or that this violates basic freedoms. Fear overrode reason. The laws didn't last. In 1923, the Supreme Court struck down Nebraska's law in Meyer v. Nebraska, ruling that the 14th Amendment protects the right to learn foreign languages. The other state laws fell similarly, but for about 5 years, speaking German in an Iowa classroom could get you in legal trouble. One of those historical moments where panic creates policy that seems baffling in retrospect. Speaking of baffling proposals, the state of Sequoia, that almost was 1905, tribal leaders from the 5 civilized tribes in Indian Territory proposed creating a Native American-controlled state called Sequoia, named after the Cherokee scholar who created the Cherokee syllabary. They wrote a constitution, organized a government, and petitioned Congress. It was a serious proposal. Well organized, democratically structured, with support from tribal nations representing thousands of people. The Constitution was progressive for its time, guaranteeing rights and representation. Congress rejected it. The federal government preferred to combine Indian Territory with Oklahoma Territory, creating the state of Oklahoma in 1907. Native American political autonomy wasn't on the table, regardless of how well planned the proposal was. The state of Sequoia remained a dream, a glimpse of what Native American self-determination might have looked like if the federal government had honored tribal sovereignty differently. Instead, Oklahoma absorbed the territory, and Sequoia became a historical what if. Though some presidents had unusual athletic backgrounds, Eisenhower's secret baseball career, Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, 34th President, once played semi-professional baseball under a fake name. 1911, while enrolled at West Point, Eisenhower played for a team in Junction City, Kansas, using the name Wilson to hide his identity because NCAA rules prohibited college athletes from playing professionally. It wasn't a long career. He played one summer, made a little money, and returned to West Point without being caught. The secret came out decades later, long after his military and political careers were established. By then, nobody particularly cared about a brief violation of amateur sports rules from 1911. But imagine, the man who planned D-Day, who became president, once snuck onto a baseball diamond pretending to be someone else for gas money. Everyone's got to start somewhere. And speaking of starting somewhere unusual, women's suffrage had an unexpected testing ground. Wyoming Territory's women vote, first 1869. Wyoming Territory grants women the right to vote. Not in a limited, conditional way. Full voting rights, identical to men. 51 years before the 19th Amendment granted national women's suffrage in 1920. Wyoming's motivation was partly progressive politics, partly practical. The territory had far more men than women, and granting women voting rights might attract more female settlers. It worked. Women voted, served on juries, held office. The territory functioned fine. When Wyoming applied for statehood in 1890, Congress suggested they revoke women's suffrage to gain approval. Wyoming's response was essentially, we'd rather stay a territory. They kept women's suffrage, got statehood anyway, and earned their nickname, the Equality State. One territory, one decision, 50 years ahead of the nation. Sometimes progress happens in unexpected places, driven by unexpected motivations, though some innovations were purely symbolic. The Peace Dollar's living model, 1921, the U.S. Mint created the Peace Dollar, a silver dollar commemorating the end of World War I. The design featured Lady Liberty in profile, but unlike previous allegorical representations, this Liberty was modeled after a real, living woman, Mary Teresa Hogan de Francici. She was the wife of the coin's designer, Anthony de Francici. Not royalty, not a historical figure, just a woman whose profile became the face of American currency. Technically, the coin depicts Liberty, not Mary specifically, but everyone knew who posed for it. This was unusual. American coins traditionally featured either allegorical figures or dead presidents. Living people weren't supposed to appear on currency. But since it was officially Liberty and not Mary de Francici, it slipped through. The Peace Dollar circulated until 1935, and Mary lived to see millions of coins bearing her likeness spent, saved, and collected. Imagine seeing your face on money. Surreal doesn't cover it. Meanwhile, in Texas, something even stranger was happening. When Republic of Texas money still spent 1845, Texas joined the United States after 9 years as an independent republic. The transition raised questions. What happens to Republic of Texas currency? The banknotes, the debt, the financial instruments of a now defunct nation? Congress decided to honor them. Republic of Texas banknotes remained legal tender for a period during the transition, allowing Texans to exchange their old money for U.S. currency. Some notes circulated alongside federal dollars for years after annexation. This created bizarre situations where you might pay with a note from a country that no longer existed, and the merchant would accept it. Like using monopoly money, except it was real, or had been real, or was real enough that the government said it counted. Eventually, all Republic of Texas currency was retired, exchanged, or became historical artifacts. But for a while, defunct nations' money bought actual goods in a functioning state. Currency, it turns out, is mostly consensus and faith. Speaking of faith in strange choices, Truman installs the first White House bowling alley. 1947, President Harry Truman decides the White House needs a bowling alley. Not wants. Needs. So he has one installed in the ground floor, replacing what had been workspace and storage areas. 2 lanes, automatic pin setters, cutting-edge technology at the time, and suddenly the president could bowl without leaving home. Truman used it occasionally. Later presidents used it more. It became a fixture of White House recreation, alongside the swimming pool, movie theater, and tennis court. Because if you're running a country, sometimes you need to throw heavy balls at pins. The bowling alley was moved during Nixon's presidency to make room for other renovations, relocated to a different section of the building. But it's still there, still functional, still occasionally used by presidents and staff. Truman's legacy includes ending World War II, desegregating the military, and White House bowling. One of these is less consequential than the others, but arguably more fun. Though not all proposals were about fun. The state of Muskogee, that never happened. 1799, a man named William Augustus Bowles, adventurer and self proclaimed leader, declared the creation of the state of Muskogee in Spanish Florida. Bowles was a fascinating character, former British soldier, adopted Creek Nation member, and ambitious schemer who saw an opportunity in the borderlands between Spanish, British, and American territories. He proclaimed himself Director General of Muskogee, established diplomatic relations with Britain, printed currency, and attempted to create a legitimate Native American nation that could negotiate as an equal with colonial powers. For a brief moment, it almost seemed possible. Spain wasn't having it. They arrested Bowles multiple times. He escaped, returned, was arrested again. The state of Muskogee never gained real traction beyond Bowles's proclamations and a few confused diplomatic letters. He died in a Havana prison in 1805, and his state died with him. It was part genuine attempt at Native American sovereignty, part con game, part international intrigue. History remembers Bowles as either a visionary or a charlatan, depending on who's telling the story. Speaking of things that shouldn't have been mailed, when anatomy books were considered obscene mail, in 1873, Congress passed a piece of legislation known as the Comstock Act. It was named after Anthony Comstock, a moral reformer who believed American society needed protection from what he viewed as corrupting influences. On paper, the law targeted obscene materials sent through the U.S. mail. In practice, its definition of obscene was extremely broad. It didn't just apply to explicit material. It also swept up medical textbooks, educational pamphlets, and scientific illustrations that showed the human body. Under this law, publishers could face prosecution simply for mailing anatomy diagrams. Medical students sometimes struggled to receive textbooks. Physicians had to be cautious about sharing educational materials, even with colleagues. What today would be considered basic health education was, at the time, treated as potentially unlawful. Anthony Comstock himself became a special agent for the post office and took an active role in enforcement. He inspected mail, initiated investigations, and brought cases against publishers and educators, all in the name of public morality. Over time, enforcement softened and courts began pushing back. In the 20th century, legal challenges narrowed the law's scope, recognizing that access to medical and scientific information served the public good. The last remaining provisions were finally removed more than a century later. The Comstock Act is a reminder that standards of acceptability change over time. What one era considers dangerous or inappropriate, another may view as essential knowledge. American history is full of these moments when fear, reform, and good intentions collide with education and progress. And while lawmakers were busy regulating what could be sent through the mail, vast parts of the country were still being sorted out on the map. The Oregon Territory's massive boundaries. 1848, the Oregon Territory was established, covering present-day Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and parts of Montana and Wyoming. Roughly 287,000 square miles of Pacific Northwest, all organized under one territorial government. The region had been jointly occupied by the U.S. and Britain since 1818, creating decades of diplomatic tension and the phrase 54-40 or fight during the 1844 presidential campaign, referring to the northern latitude boundary Americans wanted. The boundary was eventually settled at the 49th parallel in 1846, giving the U.S. the territories south of that line. 2 years later, Oregon Territory was officially organized, though it would be carved into multiple states and territories over the following decades. For a brief period, one territorial governor theoretically controlled an area larger than Texas. Managing that must have been a logistical nightmare involving months of travel to reach distant corners of your own jurisdiction. But some presidential hobbies were easier to manage than vast territories. Wilson's championship pigeons Woodrow Wilson, 28th president, scholar, reformer, and architect of the League of Nations, had an unexpected hobby: breeding pigeons. Not just keeping them as pets, but seriously breeding them, showing them in competitions, and apparently being quite skilled at it. This wasn't a childhood pastime. Wilson maintained his interest in pigeon breeding well into adulthood, though the demands of his political career and presidency eventually took priority. Still, for a man who led America through World War I and tried to reshape international diplomacy, he found time to care deeply about the genetic lineage and show quality of pigeons. It's a beautifully mundane detail. Presidents are human. They have hobbies. Sometimes those hobbies involve competitive poultry breeding. There's something almost reassuring about imagining Wilson in a pigeon coop, temporarily forgetting about war and politics, just focused on feather quality and wingspan. Though not all American currency experiments were quite so gentle. The $4 Stella that never circulated. 1879 and 1880, the U.S. Mint produced a $4 gold piece called the Stella, not for circulation, but as a pattern coin. An experimental design to test whether American currency could align better with European monetary systems for international trade. They minted fewer than 700 of them, mostly as presentation pieces for congressmen and foreign dignitaries. The Stella featured Liberty's profile with flowing hair on one side and a five-pointed star, Stella is Latin for star, on the reverse. The experiment failed. Congress never authorized the Stella for regular production. The international monetary standardization it was meant to facilitate never happened. Most of the Stellas sat in collections, unused, representing a failed economic idea. Today, surviving Stellas are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to collectors. A coin that never circulated, never worked as intended, now valued for its rarity and failure. There's probably a metaphor in there somewhere. Meanwhile, other regions wanted to carve their own identity from existing states. The proposed state of Superior Michigan's Upper Peninsula has, at various times, had residents who wanted to secede from Michigan and form their own state. Superior. The idea surfaces periodically, driven by frustration that the UP is geographically separated from the rest of Michigan, culturally distinct, and often feels ignored by state government based in the Lower Peninsula. The most serious attempt came in the 1960s, when UP residents collected signatures and lobbied for statehood. They argued they had sufficient population, distinct identity, and legitimate grievances about representation and resource allocation. Congress never seriously considered it. The UP remained part of Michigan, connected only by the Mackinac Bridge, completed 1957, and a shared but sometimes strained political identity. The Superior movement still exists in diminished form, more cultural identity than serious political effort, but maps of the proposed state of Superior occasionally surface, showing what could have been America's 50th state, carved from lake and forest. Speaking of unusual presidential pets, Roosevelt's unexpected menagerie. Theodore Roosevelt's family kept a hyena at the White House. Well, sort of. It was part of a brief private zoo that included a badger, a bear, a lizard, guinea pigs, snakes, and various other creatures that Roosevelt's children collected with their father's enthusiastic approval. The hyena, named Bill, was a gift and didn't stay long. It went to the National Zoo relatively quickly because even Roosevelt recognized that a hyena in the White House was impractical. But for a brief period, there was indeed a hyena residing at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Roosevelt's presidency was chaotic in the best way. Progressive reforms, trust busting, conservation effort, and exotic animals in the executive mansion. The man had energy that couldn't be contained by normal presidential behavior. His children once snuck a pony upstairs in the White House elevator to cheer up a sick sibling. With Roosevelt, you never knew what would happen next. Though some territorial divisions were more planned than pony-based. Dakota Territory, before the split, 1861 to 1889, the Dakota Territory covered present-day North Dakota, South Dakota, and parts of Montana and Wyoming. For 28 years, this massive region, over 365,000 square miles, operated under one territorial government. Managing it was complicated. The population was scattered, divided between agricultural settlements in the east and mining towns in the west. Transportation between regions took weeks. The territorial capital moved multiple times as different regions competed for political influence. By the 1880s, residents recognized that one territory wasn't working. The population had grown enough to support two states, and the political divisions between northern and southern regions made unified governance increasingly difficult. In 1889, Dakota Territory split, and North and South Dakota entered the Union simultaneously on November 2nd. President Harrison deliberately mixed up the paperwork so neither state could claim to have been admitted first. Both are officially the 39th and 40th states, order unknown. A diplomatic solution to a question nobody really needed answered, but some laws had clearer purposes. The 40-word literacy test. 1896, the U.S. began requiring immigrants to demonstrate literacy by reading 40 words in any language, not necessarily English, as part of the naturalization process. This requirement lasted, with modifications, until 1952. The 40-word test was controversial from the start. Supporters argued it ensured immigrants could function in American society. Critics correctly noted it was designed to restrict immigration from certain countries and discriminate against people who'd never had educational opportunities. The test evolved over time. Eventually, it required reading English specifically, not just any language. The difficulty level varied depending on who was administering it and their personal biases. Some immigration officers were lenient, others used it to reject applicants arbitrarily. It's a reminder that immigration policy has always been tangled with questions of who belongs, who deserves opportunity, and how we define American. The 40-word test was eventually abolished, but its legacy shaped decades of immigration enforcement. Speaking of unexpected presidential talents, Wilson's romantic fiction. Woodrow Wilson, before becoming president, wrote romance fiction. Sort of. His early academic writings included some surprisingly flowery prose, and he'd penned essays with romantic themes during his years as a professor and university president. Calling him a romance novelist is generous. He never published actual romance novels. But his writing style in personal letters and some published essays had romantic, idealistic qualities that stood out among the typically dry academic prose of his era. Wilson was a complex figure, scholar, idealist, reformer, and someone whose personal writings reveal a softer, more emotional side than his political image suggested. He wrote love letters to his wives. He remarried after his first wife died that were genuinely passionate and articulate. The man who tried to create the League of Nations and make the world safe for democracy also wrote sentences that would fit comfortably in 19th century sentimental literature. Complexity, turns out, is the rule rather than exception for historical figures. Speaking of complex proposals, Absaroka, the state that tried to exist. 1939, a group of businessmen and ranchers in northern Wyoming, southern Montana, and western South Dakota proposed creating a new state called Absaroka, pronounced Absorku, named after the Crow Nation's own name for themselves. The movement was partly serious political protest, partly publicity stunt. Organizers argued their region was ignored by their respective state governments, that economic and cultural differences warranted separate statehood. They elected a governor, issued press releases, and generated significant media attention. Congress wasn't interested. The federal government had no intention of redrawing state boundaries based on regional frustration. Absaroka remained a proposal, a brief movement that generated headlines and then faded. But maps of the proposed state still exist, showing a rectangular region carved from 3 states. For a moment, Absaroka felt real to the people promoting it. Reality, however, required congressional approval that never came. At least American currency experiments were more tangible. The flowing hair dollar of 1794, and 1795, the U.S. Mint produced the first silver dollars. The flowing hair dollar, featuring Lady Liberty with, appropriately, flowing hair on one side and an eagle on the reverse. These were the first dollar coins ever minted by the United States federal government. Only about 1,800 of them were made in 1794, making them extraordinarily rare today. One sold at auction in 2013 for over $10 million, the most expensive coin ever sold at that time. The design was replaced in 1795 with the draped bust design, but those first flowing hair dollars represent the beginning of American silver coinage. Every dollar coin since traces its lineage back to those first experimental pieces. Imagine being a mint worker in 1794, creating something that would be worth millions 2 centuries later. You were probably just thinking about getting paid and going home. Though some presidential fears were more immediate than coin values, Benjamin Harrison's fear of electricity. Benjamin Harrison, 23rd president, served from 1889 to 1893, right as the White House was being electrified. Electric lighting was new, not entirely trusted, and Harrison was convinced it would kill him. He reportedly refused to touch light switches, worried about electrocution. At night, if the lights were left on, they stayed on until staff came in the morning to turn them off. Harrison and his wife would rather sleep with blazing electric lights than risk touching the switches. This wasn't entirely irrational paranoia. Early electrical systems were dangerous. Wiring standards were inconsistent, and accidents happened, and electrocution was a real risk. Harrison's caution was excessive, but not completely unfounded. Still, imagine the President of the United States, leader of a rapidly modernizing nation, afraid to flip a light switch. Technology moves faster than human comfort sometimes. Eventually, Harrison got used to electricity. It didn't kill him. He died of pneumonia in 1901, lights safely switched by someone else. Meanwhile, Washington, D.C., itself dreamed of transformation. The Territory of Columbia proposal. Washington, D.C. has never been a state. It's been a federal district since 1800, governed by Congress with limited local autonomy. But that hasn't stopped repeated proposals to grant it statehood, sometimes under the name Territory of Columbia, as a stepping stone. The statehood movement gained momentum at various points in American history, driven by D.C. residents' lack of voting representation in Congress. They pay federal taxes, serve in the military, and meet all requirements of citizenship, except having senators and full congressional representation. Proposals have ranged from full statehood to retrocession, returning D.C. to Maryland, to creating a federal district containing only government buildings, while making residential areas a state. None have succeeded, largely due to political complications and constitutional questions. As of this telling, D.C. remains in limbo. Not quite a state, not quite a territory, governed by a system that feels increasingly anachronistic. The Territory of Columbia remains a proposal, not a reality. Though some laws protected specific industries in bizarre ways. When yellow margarine was illegal. Late 1800s through mid 1900s, many states banned margarine that was colored yellow. Why? To protect the dairy industry. Margarine made from vegetable oils was cheaper than butter. Making it yellow made it look like butter, which dairy farmers argued was deceptive and hurt their sales. So states required margarine to be sold in its natural color. grayish white, unappetizing, clearly not butter. Some states went further, requiring margarine to be dyed pink to make it obviously different. Others allowed yellow margarine but taxed it heavily or required special licensing. Wisconsin's anti margarine laws were particularly aggressive, lasting until 1967. People would smuggle yellow margarine from neighboring states like it was contraband. Some margarine came with yellow food coloring packets, so consumers could mix it themselves at home. The margarine wars weren't really about health or deception. They were about economic protectionism dressed up as consumer protection. Eventually, the laws faded as dairy lobbying lost power and margarine became socially acceptable. Speaking of bathtubs and modernization, Fillmore's plumbing upgrades, Millard Fillmore, 13th president, didn't install the first bathtub in the White House. That's a myth created by journalist H.L. Mencken as a hoax in 1917. But Fillmore did modernize White House plumbing significantly during his 1850 to 1853 presidency. He installed the first permanent kitchen stove, upgraded water systems, and improved sanitation facilities. The White House before Fillmore was surprisingly primitive for the nation's most important residents. His upgrades brought it closer to the standards wealthy private homes already enjoyed. The bathtub myth persists because Mencken's satirical article was so well written that people believed it, cited it in academic works, and repeated it for decades before historians definitively debunked it. Fillmore became associated with bathtubs, and the fake story overshadowed his actual plumbing improvements. So, no, Fillmore didn't introduce bathtubs to America or the White House. Yes, he did improve the plumbing. Reality is less dramatic than myth, but usually more interesting when you look closely. Meanwhile, other regions wanted names as memorable as Fillmore's bathtub myth. The State of Nickajack Rebellion, 1860 to 1861. As the Civil War began, Unionists in East Tennessee proposed creating a separate state called Nickajack, named after a Cherokee settlement. The region was culturally and politically distinct from the rest of Tennessee, opposing secession and Confederate allegiance. They held conventions, passed resolutions, and petitioned both state and federal governments for recognition. The proposal included parts of East Tennessee and possibly northern Georgia and Alabama, regions with similar Unionist sympathies. It never materialized. The Confederacy wasn't going to allow a Unionist state to form within its claimed territory. The Union was too busy fighting the war to organize new states from disputed regions. East Tennessee remained part of Tennessee, though occupied by both sides at various points during the war. Nickajack became another footnote, another failed attempt at redrawing borders during America's greatest crisis. The people who proposed it genuinely believed separation was their best option for survival and political expression. Sometimes geography and politics align, sometimes they don't. Speaking of alignment and currency, Lincoln's face on the penny 1909, the U.S. Mint issued the Lincoln cent, the first American coin to feature a real deceased president rather than an allegorical figure. This was controversial. American tradition avoided putting real people on coins, especially recently deceased ones. But 1909 marked the centennial of Lincoln's birth, and public sentiment favored honoring him. Sculptor Victor David Brenner designed the coin, featuring Lincoln's profile on the obverse. His own initials on the original design caused a minor scandal. People thought it was egotistical for an artist to sign currency, and the mint briefly removed them before restoring them in smaller form in 1918. The Lincoln cent has been minted continuously since 1909, making it the longest-running coin design in U.S. history. Billions upon billions produced. Lincoln's face, more than any other individual, has circulated through American pockets for over a century. It's fitting somehow. The president who preserved the Union, ended slavery, and died for it. immortalized in the smallest denomination of American currency. Though some presidents had careers beyond politics that seemed equally unlikely, Reagan from actor to president, Ronald Reagan spent decades as a Hollywood actor before entering politics. This isn't unusual now, but in the 1960s, when Reagan began his political career, it was nearly unprecedented. Actors were entertainers, not serious political figures. Reagan appeared in over 50 films, hosted television shows, and served as president of the Screen Actors Guild. He was genuinely famous, recognizable, successful in entertainment before ever running for office. His acting experience shaped his political style, comfortable on camera, skilled at delivering speeches, understanding how to connect with audiences emotionally. Critics argued this made him superficial. Supporters argued it made him effective at communicating complex ideas. He served as California governor from 1967 to 1975, then as U.S. president from 1981 to 1989. The actor became one of the most influential politicians of the 20th century. The transition from entertainment to politics seems more common now, but Reagan pioneered that path in American presidential politics. Speaking of pioneering territories, Montana Territory's vigilante justice. 1864, Montana Territory was established in a region that had recently experienced a gold rush, rapid population growth, and essentially no effective law enforcement. Crime was rampant. Murders, robberies, claim jumping, all common and rarely prosecuted. So settlers formed vigilance committees. These weren't mobs. They were organized groups that investigated crimes, held trials of sorts, and executed people they deemed guilty. Montana's vigilantes hanged over 20 people in 1864 alone, operating as a parallel justice system. The territorial government eventually established legitimate courts and law enforcement, but for the early years, vigilante justice was the primary legal system. Some of the people they executed were genuinely criminals. Some probably weren't. The system was rough, quick, and occasionally wrong. Montana Territory represents American frontier justice at its most extreme. Communities creating order through organized violence when official systems didn't exist yet. It worked, sort of, until proper governance caught up. But some laws were stranger than frontier justice. No ice cream on Sundays. Various American cities and states, primarily in the late 1800s and early 1900s, had blue laws prohibiting the sale of ice cream on Sundays. The reasoning was religious. Sunday was the Sabbath. A day of rest, and frivolous pleasures like ice cream constituted work for the seller and indulgence for the buyer. Enterprising ice cream vendors created a workaround: the ice cream sundae. By serving ice cream with syrup and toppings, they could claim it was a different product, not technically ice cream, thus not prohibited. The name Sunday comes from Sunday, the day it was created to circumvent. Most blue laws eventually faded. Society decided that ice cream wasn't a moral threat, regardless of what day you sold it. But for a brief period, American religious law regulated frozen desserts, and creative capitalism found a loophole. The sundae remains popular long after the laws that created it disappeared. Sometimes restrictions breed innovation, even in ice cream. And speaking of White House innovations, Rebecca the White House raccoon Calvin Coolidge, 30th president, kept a pet raccoon named Rebecca at the White House. She wasn't just a visitor, she was a beloved family pet who lived in the executive mansion, had a special house built for her, and occasionally walked on a leash with the First Lady. Rebecca arrived in 1926, originally intended as Thanksgiving dinner. Yes, someone sent the president a raccoon to eat. The Coolidges decided she was too charming to cook and adopted her instead. She became a White House fixture, appearing in photographs, attending events, and generally living her best raccoon life in one of America's most famous buildings. Coolidge was famously reserved, nicknamed Silent Cal for his quiet demeanor, but he clearly had a soft spot for unusual animals. Besides Rebecca, the Coolidges kept dogs, cats, birds, and even a pygmy hippo briefly before donating it to a zoo. There's something delightful about a president known for saying little forming a bond with a raccoon. Sometimes the quietest people surprise you. Speaking of surprising proposals, the state of Westmoreland's revolutionary dreams. 1776, while the American Revolution was just beginning, settlers in what's now northeastern Tennessee proposed creating the state of Westmoreland. This was pre-Declaration of Independence, pre-Constitution, pre any established American state government beyond the 13 colonies. The Westmoreland settlers, living in territory claimed by both North Carolina and Virginia, decided they'd govern themselves. They established a government, elected officials, and operated independently for about a year before North Carolina reasserted jurisdiction. It was part of a broader pattern. Frontier settlers moving faster than colonial governments, creating their own political structures, then either being absorbed or crushed by official authority. Westmoreland chose absorption, joining North Carolina's Washington district. The state never existed on any official map, never received recognition, but for those brief months, people living there had their own government and genuinely believed Westmoreland might become permanent. Early American history is full of these experiments in self-governance, some successful, most forgotten. Speaking of forgotten currency experiments, the racketeer nickel scandal, 1938. The U.S. Mint changed the Jefferson nickel's design, moving the Monticello building from the reverse side to a new position and altering various design elements. Seems innocent enough, right? Except criminals immediately noticed something useful. The new design, combined with wartime metal shortages leading to composition changes, made nickels easier to counterfeit. Racketeer nickels became a problem. Fake 5-cent pieces so convincing that they circulated widely before anyone noticed. The economics were strange. 5 cents isn't much money. But produce enough fake nickels and suddenly you've got a profitable criminal enterprise. The mint had inadvertently created a counterfeiter's dream. Low security currency that most people didn't examine closely because who scrutinizes a nickel? Additional security features were eventually added, and the racketeer nickel problem faded. But for a few years, America's smallest common coin was a significant counterfeiting target. Sometimes the tiniest denominations caused the biggest headaches. Though some presidential dietary choices were equally particular, Jefferson's vegetable preference. Thomas Jefferson wasn't technically a vegetarian by modern definition, but he strongly preferred vegetables and ate meat sparingly, calling himself a near-vegetarian in personal correspondence. His Monticello gardens were extensive, experimental, and central to his diet and interests. Jefferson grew dozens of vegetable varieties, many imported from Europe or acquired through his diplomatic connections. He documented planting dates, harvest yields, and growing conditions meticulously. His garden notebooks read like agricultural research combined with personal cooking notes. He did eat meat occasionally, particularly at formal dinners where refusing would be impolite. But his preference was clear. Vegetables, fruits, nuts, and grains formed the bulk of his diet by choice, not necessity. This was unusual for the time. Most wealthy Americans ate meat regularly, viewing it as a sign of prosperity. Jefferson's vegetable focus was partly philosophical. He believed it was healthier and partly practical. He found gardening intellectually satisfying. A founding father who preferred vegetables. Everyone's got their quirks. Speaking of territorial quirks, Idaho Territory's odd boundaries. 1863, Congress created Idaho Territory with boundaries that defy logical geography. The territory initially included present-day Idaho, Montana, and most of Wyoming. roughly 325,000 square miles of mountain ranges, river valleys, and scattered mining camps. Managing this was nearly impossible. The territorial capital, Lewiston, sat in the far western panhandle. Reaching the eastern portions required weeks of travel, over mountains with no roads. The territory functioned poorly as a single administrative unit. Congress carved out Montana Territory in 1864 and parts of Wyoming in 1868, gradually reducing Idaho to approximately its current shape. But for those early years, Idaho Territory was a geographic absurdity, shaped more by congressional whim than practical governance. The final Idaho boundaries, especially the narrow northern panhandle, still look strange on maps. That odd shape is the leftover remnant of a territory that once sprawled across the northern Rockies. Some borders make sense. Idaho's don't, really. But speaking of things that made sense at the time, the Anti-Dueling Law, 1839, Congress passed a law specifically banning dueling in the District of Columbia. This seems obvious now. Shooting someone should be illegal, but dueling occupied a strange, legal gray area in early America, particularly among the upper classes. The law came after the 1804 Burr-Hamilton duel, which killed Alexander Hamilton and scandalized the nation. Aaron Burr was vice president at the time. He shot a founding father in New Jersey, returned to Washington, and continued presiding over the Senate. Dueling was technically illegal in New Jersey, but enforcement was inconsistent. Congress decided federal territory needed explicit rules. The D.C. anti-dueling law imposed serious penalties: loss of voting rights, disqualification from holding office, potential prison time. It worked. Dueling declined, though it persisted in some southern states into the late 1800s. The law marked a shift. Honor killings were becoming unacceptable, even among elites. Progress, slowly. Though some presidential career paths were equally unlikely. Truman's failed haberdashery. Harry Truman, before becoming president, before his political career, worked in a failed hat shop. 1919, Truman and a business partner opened Truman and Jacobson, a men's haberdashery in Kansas City, selling shirts, ties, and hats. It failed, spectacularly. The post-World War I recession hit, sales dropped, and by 1922 they were bankrupt. Truman spent over a decade paying off debts from the failed hat shop, refusing to declare bankruptcy because he believed in honoring obligations, from failed haberdasher to U.S. president. The American dream has strange trajectories sometimes. Truman's business failure didn't define him, but it shaped his understanding of economic hardship and working-class struggles. He never forgot where he came from, a man who once couldn't successfully sell hats in Missouri. That perspective probably helped when he was making decisions that affected millions. Everyone fails at something before they succeed at something else. Truman's something else was leading the country. Speaking of leading territories, Nevada Territory's Civil War gold. 1861, right at the start of the Civil War, Congress created Nevada Territory from the western portion of Utah Territory. The timing wasn't coincidental. The Comstock lode, one of the richest silver and gold deposits ever discovered in America, was producing enormous wealth. The Union needed that wealth. Silver and gold meant currency, meant funding armies, meant financial stability during wartime. Nevada Territory was created partially to ensure federal control over mining operations and tax revenue. 3 years later, in 1864, Nevada became a state despite not meeting population requirements for statehood. Again, the reason was money in politics. Nevada's electoral votes and senators would support the Union cause and Lincoln's re-election. Battleborn became Nevada's motto, reflecting its Civil War origins. The state exists partly because the Union needed its gold and silver. Geography and politics, shaped by precious metals and war. Sometimes statehood is pragmatic rather than principled. But speaking of principles and education, The Evolution banned 1925. Tennessee passed the Butler Act, making it illegal to teach evolution in public schools. This led to the Scopes trial, one of the most famous legal cases in American history, where teacher John Scopes was prosecuted for teaching evolution to his students. Tennessee wasn't alone. Several states passed similar laws in the 1920s and 30s, driven by religious groups who saw evolution as contradicting biblical creation accounts. The laws stayed on the books for decades. The Supreme Court finally struck down these laws in 1968 with Epperson versus Arkansas, ruling they violated the Establishment Clause by promoting specific religious viewpoints. But for over 40 years, teaching evolution was literally criminal in parts of America. It's a reminder that scientific consensus and legal permission don't always align. Teachers in those states faced an impossible choice: teach accurate science and risk prosecution, or avoid evolution entirely. Progress in education policy came slowly, fought every step of the way. Though some career transitions happened faster, Reagan's movie star career before Ronald Reagan became the 40th president. He spent over 20 years as a working Hollywood actor. Not a minor player, he was genuinely successful, appearing in 53 films between 1937 and 1964, often in leading or significant supporting roles. His most famous role was probably George Gipp in Canute Rockin', All-American, 1940, which gave him the nickname the Gipper. He also appeared in war films, westerns, dramas, and lighter fare. Reagan was a recognizable face, a contract player at Warner Brothers, solidly middle tier in the Hollywood hierarchy. His acting career overlapped with early political involvement. He served as Screen Actors Guild president, testified before Congress during Red Scare investigations, and gradually shifted from Hollywood to politics. By the 1960s, his focus was entirely political. Governor of California, then president. But somewhere in archives, there are decades of Reagan films, a strange historical artifact of a president's previous career. Imagine watching old movies and seeing a future president. History layered on entertainment. Speaking of layers, the Superior movement continues. The idea of Michigan's Upper Peninsula seceding to form the state of Superior never completely died. The movement exists today, though mostly as cultural identity rather than serious political effort. You can still buy Superior merchandise, see proposed state flags, and meet people who genuinely believe the UP should be independent. The arguments remain consistent: geographic separation from the Lower Peninsula, distinct culture, different economic interests, and feeling ignored by state government. The Mackinac Bridge connects the two regions physically, but hasn't eliminated the cultural divide. Modern secession attempts fail because there's no legal mechanism for it, Congress has no interest, and most UP residents, while sometimes frustrated, aren't actually willing to go through the massive complications of statehood. But the dream persists. Maps of Superior still circulate. The idea has become part of UP identity, not a serious goal, but a symbol of regional pride and distinctiveness. Some political movements become cultural touchstones. Superior is one of them. Speaking of touchstones and currency, the 2-cent piece with a message. 1864, the U.S. Mint introduced the 2-cent piece, notable for being the first American coin to feature the phrase, "In God We Trust." This phrase, suggested during the Civil War when religious sentiment ran high, became a permanent fixture on U.S. currency. The 2-cent piece itself didn't last long. It was awkward, too similar in value to other coins, not different enough to be useful. Production ended in 1873, and they were demonetized in 1878. A 9-year experiment that failed commercially. But "In God We Trust" survived. It moved to other coins, eventually becoming mandatory on all U.S. currency by 1955. A phrase introduced on a failed denomination became one of America's most recognized national mottos. The 2-cent piece is forgotten. The message it carried endured. Sometimes the medium fails, but the message succeeds. Which brings us to a president with versatile talents beyond messaging: Ford's modeling career. Gerald Ford, 38th president, worked as a fashion model during the 1940s while attending Yale Law School. Not as a side hobby, he was legitimately successful, appearing in magazines including Cosmopolitan and working with professional modeling agencies. Ford was athletic, tall, good-looking, and needed money to pay for law school. Modeling provided income while allowing schedule flexibility for studies. He appeared in advertisements, fashion spreads, and even on magazine covers. This was before his political career, before his football career at the University of Michigan ended, before anyone imagined he'd become president. Just a law student making rent by posing for photographs. The modeling photos still exist. Searchable archives show a young Ford in various poses, selling clothes or whatever product he was hired to promote. It's surreal knowing this person would eventually become leader of the free world. Everyone starts somewhere. Ford started in front of cameras, though not for politics yet. Speaking of cameras and attention, Clinton's saxophone moment. Bill Clinton played the saxophone on the Arsenio Hall show during his 1992 presidential campaign, performing Heartbreak Hotel while wearing sunglasses. This moment became iconic, symbolizing a different kind of politician. Younger, more casual, willing to engage with popular culture rather than just traditional media. Clinton was genuinely skilled at saxophone. He'd played since childhood, considered pursuing music professionally before choosing politics. The Arsenio Hall appearance wasn't a stunt. It was authentic, a candidate sharing a real talent with voters. The performance humanized Clinton, made him relatable to younger voters, and demonstrated comfort with informal media appearances that older politicians avoided. It was strategic, but also genuine. Politics and entertainment blurred that night. Some critics called it unpresidential. Supporters called it refreshing. Either way, it worked. Clinton won the election. A saxophone solo helped elect a president. American politics is wonderfully strange sometimes. Speaking of strange political geography, Utah Territory's Mormon name. When Mormon settlers first organized the Utah region, they called it Deseret, as mentioned earlier. But when Congress created the official territory in 1850, they rejected that name and chose Utah instead, derived from the Ute tribe native to the region. This wasn't just symbolic. Congress was asserting federal authority over a region that Mormons had hoped to control independently. The name change reinforced that this would be a U.S. territory under federal governance, not a Mormon religious state. Utah Territory operated under this tension for decades: Mormon majority population and cultural dominance versus federal oversight and suspicion. Conflicts over polygamy, theocratic governance, and federal authority delayed statehood until 1896. The territory's name reflected that struggle. Utah versus Deseret, federal authority versus religious autonomy. The federal name won officially, though Deseret remained culturally significant to Mormon residents. Names carry power. The battle over Utah's name was really a battle over identity and control. Speaking of control and strange laws, the refrigerator latch law 1950s, children across America were dying in abandoned refrigerators. Old refrigerators had latches that could only be opened from outside. Kids playing hide and seek would climb inside, the door would latch, and they'd suffocate. It happened repeatedly, tragically. Congress passed the Refrigerator Safety Act in 1956, requiring refrigerators to have doors that could be opened from inside. Manufacturers switched to magnetic seals that could be pushed open with minimal force. The death stopped. This seems obvious now. Of course, refrigerators should open from inside, but it required federal legislation because manufacturers weren't changing designs voluntarily, and children kept dying. Sometimes safety regulations exist because common sense failed repeatedly. The refrigerator latch law saved lives by fixing a design flaw that should never have existed. It's a small law, rarely discussed, but it prevented countless deaths. Good governance sometimes means solving problems most people never think about. Speaking of people most people never think about, Carter's Peanut Farm. Jimmy Carter, 39th president, was a peanut farmer in Georgia before entering politics. Not a gentleman farmer with hired help, Carter actively worked the farm, understood agriculture deeply, and built a successful business in peanut production and warehousing. His farming background shaped his political perspective, understanding rural economics, agricultural policy, and small business challenges from direct experience. He wasn't theorizing about farm policy, he'd lived it. When Carter became president in 1977, he placed his farm business in a blind trust to avoid conflict of interest. The farm struggled during his presidency without his management, and he returned to debt and a failing business when he left office. Carter rebuilt the farm and his finances through speaking fees, book deals, and eventually his post-presidential humanitarian work. But for a while, being president financially ruined his peanut business. Public service sometimes costs more than people realize, though some costs are stranger than financial ones. The proposed state of McDonald, Pennsylvania's northeastern region, frustrated with state government in the 1860s, briefly proposed creating a separate state called McDonald. The name honored a local political figure, and the proposal reflected regional economic and cultural tensions with the rest of Pennsylvania. It went nowhere. Congress wasn't interested in splitting Pennsylvania. The population wasn't sufficient for statehood, and the movement lacked the organization or funding to seriously pursue separation. McDonald became a footnote, another failed state proposal among dozens in American history. The region remained part of Pennsylvania, its brief dream of independence forgotten except by local historians. The pattern repeats: regions feel ignored, propose statehood, get rejected, remain part of their original state. Sometimes the existing boundaries are sticky, resistant to change regardless of local sentiment. McDonald, Nickajack, Superior, Absaroka, all proposed, all rejected, all now just historical curiosities. Speaking of curiosities and currency, the large cents awkward size. Early American pennies, called large cents, were enormous compared to modern pennies. Minted from 1793 to 1857, they were roughly the size of a modern half-dollar, made of pure copper and heavy enough to be genuinely inconvenient to carry. The size wasn't arbitrary. The cent had to contain 1 cent's worth of copper by weight, based on the metal's market value. As copper prices fluctuated, the mint struggled with either making unprofitably large cents or profitably small ones that nobody trusted. By 1857, the mint switched to smaller cents made of copper-nickel alloy, reducing size while maintaining denomination. The large cents were demonetized, though many circulated for years afterward before being collected or melted. Imagine pockets full of half-dollar-sized pennies. Your pants would need reinforcement. Fashion and currency don't always align well. The large cent represents early American monetary experimentation, well-intentioned, logically based on metal value, and utterly impractical. Speaking of impractical ventures, Truman's Hat Shop Redux. We've mentioned Truman's failed haberdashery, but it deserves deeper consideration. The shop, Truman and Jacobson, wasn't just a business failure. It was a financial disaster that haunted Truman for years. His partner, Eddie Jacobson, eventually declared bankruptcy. Truman refused, considering it dishonorable. He paid creditors slowly, over years, even while working as a county judge and later senator. The debt from a failed hat shop followed him through his political rise. This experience shaped Truman's economic policies. He understood debt, understood small business failure, understood that some economic downturns destroy people's lives and dreams. That perspective influenced his decisions as president. A failed hat shop in Kansas City indirectly shaped post World War II economic policy. Connections like that make history fascinating. Truman never sold hats successfully, but he led America through post war Reconstruction, authorized the Marshall Plan, and desegregated the military. Sometimes your failures prepare you for different successes. Speaking of preparation and territories, Nevada's fast track to statehood. We've touched on Nevada's Civil War statehood, but the speed deserves emphasis. Nevada Territory was created in March 1861. Statehood came in October 1864. 3 years and 7 months from territory to state. For comparison, most territories waited decades. Arizona waited 49 years. New Mexico waited 62 years. Nevada rushed through because the Union desperately needed its silver, gold, and political support during the Civil War. The state constitution was telegraphed to Washington, the longest telegram ever sent at that time, costing over $4,000. Speed mattered more than cost. Nevada's population was barely 15,000, well below normal statehood requirements. Congress didn't care. The precedent, pragmatic politics over established requirements, would influence future statehood decisions. Battleborn truly meant born from political necessity and wartime expedience. Nevada exists partly because timing aligned with need. Speaking of timing and laws, the evolution ban finally falls. Tennessee's anti-evolution law, passed in 1925, stayed on the books until 1967. That's 42 years. 2 generations of Tennessee students legally couldn't be taught evolution in public schools. Other states maintained similar laws. Arkansas kept theirs until the Supreme Court struck it down in 1968 with Epperson versus Arkansas. The court ruled unanimously that banning evolution violated the Establishment Clause because it promoted specific religious viewpoints over scientific consensus. The decision didn't end the controversy. Debates shifted to equal time laws requiring creation science alongside evolution, then to intelligent design, and onward. But the outright bans ended in the late 1960s. For context, we landed on the moon in 1969. At the same time, some American states were still legally prohibiting teachers from explaining how species change over time. Progress moves unevenly. The evolution bans represent tension between religious belief and scientific education that hasn't fully resolved. But at least teachers can't be prosecuted for teaching biology anymore. Speaking of prosecution and unusual presidential backgrounds, Reagan's lifeguarding heroics. Before acting, before politics, Ronald Reagan worked as a lifeguard at Lowell Park in Dixon, Illinois, during summer breaks from 1926 to 1932. Over 7 summers, he reportedly saved 77 lives from the Rock River. 77. That's not a small number. Reagan kept a log, carved a notch in a piece of wood for each rescue. The river had dangerous currents, and swimmers frequently needed help. Some historians question whether all 77 rescues were life-threatening emergencies or if some were just assisting struggling swimmers. But Reagan's contemporaries confirmed he was an active, dedicated lifeguard who took his job seriously. Imagine being saved by a future president. Some of those 77 people lived long enough to see their teenage lifeguard become leader of the free world. That's a strange cocktail party story. Reagan's lifeguarding came up occasionally during his political career, usually to demonstrate his work ethic and service mindset. Not a bad origin story for a politician. Speaking of origins, Hawaii Territory's royal past. Hawaii became a U.S. territory in 1900, but before that, it was an independent kingdom. Not just culturally independent, an actual monarchy recognized by other nations, with kings and queens, a constitution, diplomatic relations, the whole structure. The Hawaiian kingdom lasted from 1810 to 1893, when American businessmen and Marines overthrew Queen Liliuokalani in a coup. The queen surrendered under protest, believing the U.S. government would restore her throne. It didn't. Hawaii became a republic briefly, then a territory, then finally a state in 1959. But for nearly a century, it was a sovereign nation with its own monarchy, culture, and political system. The transition wasn't peaceful or democratic. It was colonialism, forced annexation, cultural suppression. Hawaii's path to U.S. territory and statehood involved significant injustice that shaped the island's relationship with the federal government. Some territories joined willingly. Hawaii was taken, then gradually accepted the situation. The history matters. Speaking of history that matters, Christmas banned in Massachusetts. 1659 to 1681, celebrating Christmas was illegal in Massachusetts. The Puritan-controlled colonial government considered Christmas a pagan celebration without biblical basis, and anyone caught observing it could be fined 5 shillings. No feasting, no decorations, no time off work. Christmas was treated as a regular day, and celebrating it was considered immoral and possibly heretical. The Puritans were serious about theological purity and weren't interested in folk traditions they deemed insufficiently scriptural. The law was repealed in 1681 when the British monarchy reasserted control over colonial governance, but cultural opposition to Christmas persisted in New England for decades afterward. Even after legal prohibition ended, many New Englanders continued viewing Christmas celebration with suspicion. By the 1900s, obviously, this had changed completely. But for over 20 years, Massachusetts criminalized Christmas. The war on Christmas was real, just not in the direction people usually imagine. Sometimes religious conviction leads to strange laws. Speaking of strange laws about identity, Ford's double cover appearance. Gerald Ford didn't just model for magazines. He appeared on the cover of Cosmopolitan in 1942, not as president, as a male model. The same publication, decades before his political career, featured Ford modeling athletic wear. The photos still exist, archived, and occasionally resurfaced when people want to emphasize Ford's unusual pre-political life. He was genuinely photogenic, fit from his football career, and apparently comfortable in front of cameras. Ford's modeling career is one of the stranger presidential origin stories. From Cosmopolitan cover to president, it's not a typical trajectory. He never seemed embarrassed by his modeling past. Why would he be? It was honest work that paid for law school. Ford's practicality extended to his entire biography. Do what needs doing, don't overthink it, move forward. That Cosmopolitan cover represents a very different era in Ford's life and America's culture. Both changed significantly by the time he reached the Oval Office. Speaking of cultural changes and proposed states, the state of Shasta's Northern Dreams, Northern California residents have periodically proposed creating the state of Shasta, or sometimes the state of Jefferson, separating from California to form their own state. The most serious attempt came in 1941, when counties in Northern California and Southern Oregon declared they were in patriotic rebellion. They set up roadblocks, stopped traffic, handed out proclamations, and demanded recognition. The movement had genuine support, driven by frustration with Sacramento's governance and feeling economically neglected. Then Pearl Harbor happened. December 7th, 1941. Suddenly, rebellion against your own state government seemed inappropriate during wartime. The movement dissolved almost immediately, participants volunteering for military service instead. Shasta Jefferson proposals resurface occasionally. The grievances, rural versus urban divide, resource allocation, political representation haven't disappeared. But the 1941 movement came closest to actual success, ended only by World War. Timing matters in politics. Sometimes external events overwhelm local concerns. Speaking of local concerns and currency, why nickels are called nickels. The 5-cent piece is called a nickel because it's made of nickel. Well, partially. Currently, US nickels are 75% copper and 25% nickel. But when the coin was introduced in 1866, the nickel content was significant enough that people started calling it the nickel informally. Before 1866, 5-cent pieces were small silver coins called half dimes. They were tiny, easy to lose, and their silver content made them expensive to produce. The larger nickel-copper 5-cent piece solved both problems. Easier to handle, cheaper to manufacture. The name stuck. Over 150 years later, we still call 5-cent pieces nickels, even though most people have no idea about the metal content or the reasoning behind the name. Currency names often reflect forgotten practical decisions. The nickel is called that because of its metal composition, which most people using nickels never think about. Language preserves history even when we forget why. Speaking of forgetting and preservation, Utah's Deseret Dream lives on, though Congress rejected the name Deseret for Utah Territory. The term never completely disappeared from Mormon culture. The Deseret News, founded 1850, still publishes. The Deseret alphabet was developed in the 1850s as an alternative writing system. Deseret Industries, a Mormon thrift store chain, operates today. Deseret became a cultural marker, a reminder of what Utah's settlers hoped to create: a Mormon-controlled region with significant autonomy and distinct identity. The name's persistence reflects how deeply the dream of Deseret mattered to early Mormon settlers. Utah became a state in 1896, but only after decades of conflict over polygamy, theocratic governance, and federal authority. The final statehood came with concessions: polygamy banned, church and state separated in law if not always practice. Deseret lost politically, but won culturally. The name lives on, embedded in institutions and memory. Sometimes what you call yourself matters more than what others call you. Cultural identity persists even when political goals fail. Speaking of goals and refrigerators, the Refrigerator Safety Act's impact. The Refrigerator Safety Act of 1956 seems like a minor law, but its impact was immediate and measurable. Child deaths from refrigerator entrapment dropped essentially to zero within years of the magnetic seal requirement. Before the law, these deaths were common enough that parents warned children about abandoned refrigerators the way we warn about traffic or strangers. Old refrigerators were death traps, discarded in alleys and dumps, waiting for curious children. The law worked because it was simple, enforceable, and manufacturers complied. Magnetic seals became standard. Old refrigerators were modified or destroyed. The problem was solved through straightforward regulation. It's a reminder that government regulation can save lives when properly targeted at genuine hazards. Not every regulation is bureaucratic overreach. Some fix deadly design flaws that markets won't address voluntarily. The children saved by the Refrigerator Safety Act never knew they were saved. Prevention is invisible, but the law worked quietly, effectively, saving lives by fixing a problem most people never knew existed. Speaking of invisible problems, Carter's financial sacrifice. When Jimmy Carter placed his peanut farm in a blind trust during his presidency, it seemed like the ethical thing to do. Avoid conflicts of interest, ensure presidential decisions aren't influenced by personal business concerns. The trust managers made poor decisions. The farm struggled. By the time Carter left office in 1981, his business was over $1 million in debt. Public service had bankrupted him. Carter spent years rebuilding financially through book deals, speaking fees, and eventually his humanitarian work with the Carter Center. He recovered financially, but at significant personal cost. The blind trust was supposed to protect ethics. Instead, it cost Carter his family business. It's a reminder that ethical behavior sometimes comes with real financial consequences. Carter never complained publicly about this. He made his choice, accepted the outcome, and moved on. That kind of quiet integrity doesn't always make headlines, but defines character. Sometimes doing the right thing costs more than expected. Speaking of costs and proposals, the state of McDonald's brief moment. Pennsylvania's McDonald proposal, mentioned earlier, deserves a bit more context. The region wasn't just frustrated, it was economically distinct. Coal mining territory with interests that didn't align with Philadelphia's merchant and manufacturing economy. The 1860s were full of these proposals. The Civil War had broken the idea that existing boundaries were permanent. If the country could split into Union and Confederacy, why couldn't states subdivide along economic or cultural lines? McDonald represented that moment of possibility. For a brief period, it seemed like America's map might be redrawn along more logical regional boundaries. It didn't happen. The war ended, federal authority reasserted itself, and the energy for redrawing state boundaries dissipated. McDonald remained a proposal, nothing more. But the impulse, the feeling that your region deserves a separate recognition and governance, never completely disappears. It surfaces periodically in American politics, usually unsuccessfully. Regionalism is stronger than nationalism sometimes, even in failure. Speaking of failures and successes in currency, the large cent's legacy. The large cent, awkwardly sized and impractical, circulated for 64 years before being replaced. That's a long time for a failed design to persist. But replacing currency takes time, requires new minting infrastructure, and faces resistance from people accustomed to existing denominations. The switch to small cents in 1857 wasn't just about convenience. It represented changing ideas about money itself, shifting from intrinsic metal value to representative value, from commodity currency to fiat currency. Large cents had to contain 1 cent's worth of copper. Small cents didn't. They represented 1 cent because the government said they did, not because their metal content matched their face value. That shift, seemingly minor, was philosophically significant. Money became abstraction, agreed upon value rather than inherent worth. The small cent represented that conceptual change. Currency evolution reflects broader economic philosophy shifts. The large cent to small cent transition was really about how societies think about value itself. Speaking of value and ventures, Truman's debt and honor. Harry Truman could have declared bankruptcy after his haberdashery failed. His partner did, but Truman considered bankruptcy dishonorable, a betrayal of creditors who trusted him. He paid every debt, slowly, over years. While working as a county judge, while serving as senator, Truman sent money to creditors from a failed 1920s hat shop. Some thought he was foolish. Truman thought he was honorable. This wasn't legal obligation. Bankruptcy would have discharged the debts. This was personal ethics, a belief that promises mattered more than legal technicalities. That same principle guided his presidency. Truman made decisions based on what he thought was right, regardless of political convenience. His financial stubbornness and his political integrity stemmed from the same source. The failed hat shop taught Truman that character means honoring commitments even when it's costly. That lesson shaped his presidency and legacy. Personal failures often teach more valuable lessons than easy successes. Speaking of lessons from the past, Nevada's Telegraph Constitution. Nevada's Constitution was telegraphed to Washington in October 1864, over 2 days, at enormous cost. The telegram was over 175 pages, the longest ever sent at that time. Why telegraph it? Speed. Nevada needed statehood before the November election to provide electoral votes for Lincoln's reelection and congressional votes for Reconstruction amendments. Every day mattered. The telegraph cost over $4,000, equivalent to roughly $100,000 today. Nevada territorial government paid it, considering statehood worth the expense. It worked. Nevada became a state October 31st, 1864, just in time for the election. Lincoln won, Reconstruction amendments passed, and Nevada's fast-track statehood helped secure both. The telegraphed Constitution represents how badly the Union needed Nevada's support. Political necessity drove the speed, cost didn't matter, and Nevada's statehood became the fastest on record. Sometimes history moves at telegraph speed. Expense be damned. Speaking of expense and education, the anti-evolution law's last days, when Arkansas's anti-evolution law was struck down in 1968, it had been on the books for 43 years. Generations of teachers had either ignored it, risking prosecution, taught around it, confusing students, or complied, leaving students scientifically illiterate about biology. The Supreme Court's decision was unanimous and clear. You can't ban scientific theories because they conflict with religious beliefs. The First Amendment prohibits it. But the victory was narrow. The decision didn't end attempts to restrict evolution education. It shifted tactics. Equal time laws, disclaimers, intelligent design requirements all tried to accomplish through other means what outright bans couldn't. The fight over evolution in schools continues in different forms. Epperson versus Arkansas won a battle, not the war. Science education and religious belief remain in tension in some communities. The law changed, but the underlying conflict didn't disappear. Progress in education policy isn't linear or permanent. Speaking of permanence and change, Reagan's 77 rescues reconsidered. Ronald Reagan's claim of 77 lifeguard rescues has been scrutinized by historians. Some question whether all were genuine life-threatening emergencies. Others note that Reagan's log and contemporaneous accounts support the number. The truth probably lies in between. Some rescues were genuinely dangerous, swimmers in real distress. Others were probably assists, helping tired swimmers, preventing potential problems rather than saving people actively drowning. But even if only half were serious emergencies, that's still nearly 40 lives saved. And the others? Preventing problems before they become emergencies is valuable too. Reagan clearly took his job seriously, worked hard, and helped a lot of people during those 7 summers. Whether the exact number was 77, 50, or 90 doesn't change the basic fact. He was a dedicated lifeguard who saved lives. The scrutiny reflects how presidential histories get examined, re-examined, and debated endlessly. Every detail becomes contested terrain. Sometimes the truth is less important than the pattern. Reagan served, helped people, did his job. Speaking of service in Hawaii's path from kingdom to state. The Hawaiian kingdom's overthrow in 1893 wasn't supported by President Cleveland, who investigated and concluded the coup was illegal. He attempted to restore Queen Liliuokalani, but was blocked by the provisional government and later by his successor, President McKinley. Hawaii spent 5 years as a republic, 1894 to 1899, then became a U.S. territory in 1900. Statehood came 59 years later, in 1959. The path wasn't smooth. Hawaii's population was majority non-white, which delayed statehood due to congressional racism. The island's strategic military importance eventually outweighed prejudice, and statehood came alongside Alaska's. Hawaii's stories about colonialism, strategic interests, and eventual acceptance. The kingdom was taken illegally, the territory organized regardless, and statehood granted when politically convenient. It's a complicated legacy. Native Hawaiians didn't choose American annexation. It was imposed, then normalized across generations, until statehood seemed inevitable. History's darkest chapters don't disappear just because time passes. Speaking of time and Christmas, Massachusetts Christmas ban's cultural legacy. Even after Massachusetts repealed its Christmas ban in 1681, New England remained suspicious of Christmas celebrations for centuries. The Puritans' theological opposition left cultural residue. Christmas didn't become a federal holiday until 1870. Before that, in much of New England, December 25th was a regular workday. Schools opened, businesses operated, and celebrating was seen as vaguely disreputable. The cultural shift happened gradually. Immigration brought Catholic and German Lutheran Christmas traditions. Commercialization made Christmas profitable. By the late 1800s, New England had mostly embraced Christmas, though some Puritan descendants remained skeptical. Today, the idea that Christmas was once illegal in Massachusetts seems absurd. But laws shape culture, and culture shapes memory. And for nearly 250 years, New England's relationship with Christmas was complicated by its Puritan origins. Religious laws have long echoes. Even after repeal, cultural attitudes persist across generations. Sometimes what's banned becomes more powerful in absence. Speaking of power and modeling, Ford on Cosmopolitan. The full story. Gerald Ford's Cosmopolitan cover appearance in 1942 wasn't scandalous by the era's standards. The magazine featured male models regularly, and Ford was modeling sportswear, athletic clothes for an athletic former football player. The photos show Ford looking clean-cut, wholesome, exactly what you'd expect from a Midwestern college athlete turned law student. No controversy, just a guy modeling clothes to pay for school. Decades later, during and after his presidency, the photos resurfaced as curiosities. A president who'd modeled? It was unusual, but not shameful. Ford never hid his modeling past. Why would he? It was honest work during difficult economic times, allowing him to afford law school. He saw no conflict between modeling and later political service. The Cosmopolitan cover represents Ford's practical approach to life. Identify what needs doing, do it competently, don't overthink it, move forward. That same pragmatism defined his presidency. Do the necessary work without drama. Speaking of drama and northern rebellions, the Jefferson-Shasta Rebellion of 41. The 1941 State of Jefferson Rebellion deserves fuller attention. Citizens in Northern California and Southern Oregon weren't just complaining. They'd organized, elected provisional government, designed a state seal, and were actively stopping traffic at roadblocks. The roadblocks were theatrical, but effective. Rebels would stop cars, hand drivers' proclamations explaining the grievances, and wave them through. They wanted publicity, not violence. They wanted Sacramento and Salem to notice them. And it was working. Media coverage was significant. The rebellion was gaining traction. Then December 7th happened. Pearl Harbor ended the rebellion instantly. Suddenly, internal political disputes seemed trivial. Rebels enlisted, went to war, and the state of Jefferson dissolved. After the war, some tried reviving it. The movement never regained momentum. Jefferson remained a dream, occasionally resurrected, but never seriously pursued. World War II ended a lot of things, including Northern California's best chance at statehood. Speaking of chances and nickels, the nickel's odd survival. The nickel is strange. It costs more to produce than it's worth. About 8 cents to mint a 5-cent piece currently. The penny has the same problem, but at least pennies are smaller and lighter. Nickels are chunky, heavy, expensive to produce, and somewhat redundant in a world where electronic payments dominate. Many countries have eliminated 5-cent pieces. Canada stopped making pennies entirely, but America keeps the nickel, partly from tradition, partly because eliminating it would create pricing complications, and partly because nobody's pushed hard enough to remove it. The nickel persists despite economic irrationality. It costs the government money, serves limited practical purpose in modern commerce, and will probably disappear eventually. But not yet. The nickel survives, outlasting more rational arguments for its elimination through sheer institutional inertia and nostalgic attachment to existing currency denominations. Sometimes things persist, not because they make sense, but because changing them seems like too much effort. Speaking of persistence, Deseret's cultural victory. The state of Deseret failed politically but won culturally. Utah might be the official name, but Deseret remains embedded in Mormon identity and Utah institutions. Deseret Book Company, Deseret Industries, Deseret News, Deseret Mutual. The name appears throughout Utah's institutional landscape. It represents what Mormon settlers hoped to create: an autonomous region where they could practice their religion and govern themselves. That dream didn't materialize politically. Federal authority prevailed, polygamy ended, church and state separated in law. But Deseret survived as cultural memory, a reminder of Utah's distinct origins. Names carry power even when the political projects they represent fail. Deseret represents Mormon identity in ways Utah never could. Federal authority won the political battle but couldn't erase the cultural dream. Utah is the legal name. Deseret is the emotional one. Cultural victories sometimes matter more than political ones, lasting longer and shaping identity more deeply. And that brings us to the end. 99 completely true facts about American history that sound like someone made them up after too much coffee and not enough sleep. We poisoned our own alcohol. We mailed children. We fought over pigs. We created musical instruments from glass bowls and banned yellow margarine to protect butter. Presidents modeled for Cosmopolitan, saved 77 lives as lifeguards, and refused to touch light switches because electricity seemed like witchcraft. Every weird, absurd, beautifully human fact you've heard tonight actually happened. You can look them up. I did. Twice. Because honestly, some of this stuff seemed too strange to be real. But that's the thing about history. Reality doesn't need to make sense. It just needs to happen. And centuries later, we get to lie here in the dark, marveling at how our ancestors stumbled through nation building while keeping raccoons as pets and telegramming entire constitutions. So tonight, as you drift off, be thankful you're not a president hiding from light switches, a child being mailed to grandma's house, or a soldier in the US. Camel Corps wondering how your life got this weird. Sweet dreams. And remember, the truth is always stranger than you think.